Welcome to Hard Talk from Brussels. I'm Stephen Sacker. In an era of great power rivalry and increasing hostility, EU leaders profess confidence in the ability of their bloc to compete with the US and China. But just how well positioned is Europe to safeguard its own prosperity and security? Well, my guest is the EU Economy Commissioner, Paolo Gentiloni. Are internal divisions over economic policy, migration, and the rise of populism undermining the credibility of the EU? Commissioner Paolo Gentiloni, welcome to Hard Talk.
My pleasure.
Let me begin by some words written in The Economist magazine very recently. Gloom, they said, is now spreading across the continent. Your economy commissioner, the European economy is struggling. Are you gloomy?
Well, the economy is struggling. I'm not gloomy. I just propose to look to what we were expecting exactly 1 year ago. So beginning of October 2022, we had a double-digit inflation. We were expecting recession. And indeed, we were also concerned about energy supply, blackouts, because of course, leaving the Russian fossil fuels was not at all an easy story. So if we want to look to the optimistic side of the moon, I think we would say that, yes, we avoided recession. Yes, we have now inflation at 4.3%, which is very far from the double-digit inflation 1 year ago. And the economy is still growing. But of course, you are right, the economy is struggling because very low growth. How long with this low growth?
That is the point, isn't it? Low growth is your problem. The IMF has reduced growth forecasts across the European Union down to less than 1%, 0.8% for the year. There are some important countries, no more important country than Germany, which are really struggling to deliver any growth at all. Germany may slip into recession, and that's a huge drag on the entire EU economy. You've got to be worried about that.
Indeed, also our own forecast is 0.8% for this year. But honestly, I think we should take into account one big thing. The big thing is that the European economy had a very strong rebound after the pandemic. The EU economy grew more than China and US, which was, in my own lifetime, unpredictable, especially in relation to China in 2022. But then we had a second black swan, which was the aggression, the Russian aggression. And this, of course, is affecting all the world in geopolitical terms. But in economic terms, it is, of course, affecting, in particular, Europe.
And we will talk more about Ukraine and Russia later in this interview. But for right now, I just want to focus on one deep problem you've got, which is institutional, and it affects your particular responsibilities. Europe has a Stability and Growth Pact, which is supposed to unite all EU member states in a collective effort to maintain fiscal responsibility. There are certain rules about how much national debt a country can run and what kind of deficit year on year it can run. Those rules have been suspended, first because of COVID, then because of the Ukraine war. You want to bring those rules back, but there is no agreement whatsoever between your members on how to do that. That's a fundamental problem.
We really don't want to only to bring them back. We are a little bit more ambitious. We would like to reform them.
Some would and some wouldn't.
Well,
that's the whole point.
I would say everyone would like to reform them, but in different and sometimes opposite directions. And this is the political, tricky and difficult story. Why? Well, first, why everyone is aware of the need to reform them? Because they were useful from a certain point of view. We have a threshold of 3% of deficit, for example, that we will keep and was useful. But on the other side, they were not able to reduce our debt, especially for countries with high debt.
Especially for countries like yours, Italy. Italy right now running a national debt around 140% plus of GDP. In Greece, it's around 170%. Even in France, it's more than 110%. The rules have consistently been broken. And now there is a raging argument between France and Germany about whether more flexible rules should be introduced. I would put it to you that this total lack of agreement sums up a fundamental problem with the EU and running an EU economy. There are just too many different political national interests.
There are national interests, as you know very well, but at the end, I am confident that an agreement will be reached on these rules.
Why are you confident?
I'm confident because I'm speaking every day or every couple of days with finance ministers, and I see that the distance among them is reducing. But first of all, I'm seeing that they are all aware of the need to reach an agreement. Which is the point? The point is that to have more realistic rules means that you will have more enforceable rules. And at the same time that you can have rules encouraging growth. This is the deal that we need.
But what's wrong
because we had very ambitious rules. They were not implemented, not enforced, and the debt continued to grow, and we had low growth.
And that looks like a systemic problem. And there's other problems too, which again, you have to take some responsibility for as economy commissioner. For example, the idea was post-COVID to create this massive fund that the EU would raise money for and which would be distributed to those countries worst hit by the pandemic. It was worth over, 700 billion euros in theory. The problem is that in efforts to get countries to come up with specific plans to invest the money to generate new growth, those countries have completely failed. Italy and Spain are prime examples. They're supposed to take more than 200 billion euros. They can't even figure out how to invest the money.
Well, until now, we disbursed 163 billion out of
a theoretical 700 and something.
Out of 700. And we have a plan going until the end of 2026. So, yes, you are right, we have delays.
Why? Why? Again, why? You know, European people will be watching this interview thinking, we are really struggling, and the EU institutions and those who talk about generating pan-EU economic growth are simply failing to deliver.
No, I think people is aware of the fact that we have an unprecedented decision, which is to put together 700, as you said, 700 billion, which is an enormous amount of common money. And we reach this common money with common funding. So the European Commission going to markets and raising this money.
But Commissioner, what is lacking is common collective purpose, and indeed sometimes even common standards of integrity. Olaf, the anti-fraud office of the EU, has already said just a couple of months ago, it's now investigating serious potential fraud in the use of this pandemic recovery cash. They wouldn't say which countries, but they said there's some serious issues there. And we know that funds earmarked for Hungary and for Poland have been suspended because you're deeply unhappy with some of the things the governments in those countries are doing. So there's a real mess here.
No, not a mess. This is really...
Sounds like a mess.
No. I think this is really what the common money are supposed to be used for.
Well, not for fraud.
Because if, not for fraud, of course, and if there will be fraud, there will be prosecuted. But conditionality, we have conditions for this common money. You can't raise in the market 700 billions and then give to member states them without targets, common thresholds, and conditionalities. Problems with Poland and Hungary is that we have some conditions connected to the respect of the rule of law that are absolutely necessary for us to disburse the money.
Is Hungary, for example, ever going to get the money?
I think they will. We are working to make this possible, but they have to deliver on the rule of law. Do you think that this is not the right way? I think it is the right way. Because the problem that we had in the past was that, okay, the Commission is giving good recommendations to member states, and member states are accepting these recommendations, yes or no. 60%, 70%. Now, if you have common funding attached to your recommendations, I think it's an enormous tool to make our economy, but not only economy. We were talking on rule of law.
Right. So we've dealt with the growth situation. We've talked about the impact of the pandemic. We'll come back to the Russia-Ukraine war. Let's talk about your belief in one of the most fundamental challenges facing the EU in economic terms. That is transitioning to a greener European economy. It's a big thing for you. Turns out that when it comes to delivering, when it comes to the actual money to enable this green transition, everything that the EU is doing looks like peanuts compared with what the United States and China are doing.
Well, I think if we look to the situation now, I think the European common funding we were referring to is strongly helping from this point of view.
Forgive me, but in terms of actual money from the EU for the green transition, I'm struggling to see more than, tens of billions that are promised and not actually delivered yet, but promised. But look at the United States. Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act has actually delivered more than 700 billion US dollars to renewable energy infrastructure, to electric vehicles, to green manufacturing. It's an extraordinary investment. The EU has nothing like it.
Well, there is something comparable to this, which is exactly what we were referring to. You should know that 280 billion, part of this big Next Generation EU program, are exactly for the green transition. And this is mandatory. So you have to demonstrate, if you want our common money to be disbursed, that you delivered on renewables, on hydrogen, on heat pumps, on wind farms, etc. And these are, for us, these 280 billion, unprecedented and good.
With greatest respect,
the problem is what will happen after 2026.
Well, to be honest with you, a lot of what the EU and its various member state governments are committing seems to be future-oriented and not actually delivered. And here's the words of your fellow commissioner, Mr. Sinkevicius, who's the Environment Commissioner. He says, we have to be honest, it is definitely different circumstances now compared with 2019, when we did have maximum support and political willingness to act on these green issues right across Europe. He acknowledges that the politics of this in Europe has fundamentally changed.
Well, I think the great change that we had with Next Generation EU putting together common fundings, Euro bonds, something that was, you worked here in Brussels some time ago.
Yeah,
and you may remember that the Eurobond was a sort of devil to address.
Of course.
Now, the Eurobonds are there for 750 billion. And substantial part of this is for the green transition.
Yeah, but address my point about politics. If you look at what's happening in Germany right now, where there is a huge argument about what to do on domestic heating, phasing out fossil fuel, oil and gas heating. Look at the argument over even the ban on petrol and diesel cars being sold after 2035, where people are pushing back. The Poles are even launching a lawsuit against the EU because of that deadline. In Sweden, for example, they've stopped investing in high-speed rail. They've scrapped incentives to buy fossil-free cars. You can look right across Europe. You can even look at the UK outside the EU, but nonetheless part of a trend which is loosening some of the commitments to some of the net zero projects. But this is a European trend.
This is a European problem. And my view, of course, with all respect for the decision that were taken by the UK Prime Minister, is that the European Commission is not now deciding to put the brake on the process.
No, but don't just say, oh, this is a UK phenomenon. As I said, this is happening across the European Union.
I agree with you. It's a European problem. But what are we, how are we reacting to this European problem? Of course, we need some flexibility, because if you ask to households to change their heating systems in a few weeks or in a couple of years, you could have a difficult reaction. No, we know that we need to support especially lower-income households.
But this to quote Greta Thunberg, is not just a climate challenge, it is a climate emergency.
And this is the reason why the European Commission is not putting the brake to the process. So we have to deal with the problem, which is a common European problem, but without changing our point of view. This would be a terrible mistake also for the European economy, because we are competing with the United States and China. If we put the brakes on the process, we will be lagging behind in this competition.
Let's talk about one specific aspect of the energy crisis Europe has been through. It, of course, is linked to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And one of the goals, the diplomatic goals of the EU in the last year and a half, has been to economically isolate Russia, to put deep pressure based on economic sanctions on the Kremlin. Isn't the truth that as another winter looms, we see increasing evidence that key EU member states are finding ways to circumvent economic sanctions on Russia, not least in the energy market?
Yes, the risk of circumvention is there, and we have to address it. I also know that the packages of sanctions that we delivered is really very impressive. It happens.
It's impressive on paper. You've just said to me quite candidly, yes, circumvention is happening. So what are you doing about it? We have always solutions to the problems. The fact is then if the solution will work or not. So let's take one specific.
We have a special envoy on circumvention who is touring all European member states to check and avoid.
So let's take one specific, if I may, Commissioner. Research in Germany shows that the amount of oil product imported into Germany from India has risen by more than 10 times in the last year. At the very same time, Indian imports of Russian oil have spiraled. There's an obvious connection there. The oil that Germany is getting from India probably comes from Russia. Are you telling the Germans right here, right now, they have to cut that out?
I think we should address this problem as we are addressing similar problems of triangulation, increase of export from EU member states to Central Asian countries.
You could talk about Kazakhstan, you could talk about Armenia.
Kazakhstan, and increase of export from Kazakhstan to Russia.
Exactly.
This is how the risk of circumvention is working. And
well, you clearly know about it. I'm just not being convinced that you're stopping it.
We work on this. We work to stop this. At the same time, first, it happens that I was the Italian foreign minister after the annexation of Crimea, and I can assure you that the level of sanctions that the EU decided in front of this crisis and the level of support to Ukraine that the EU delivered after this crisis is incomparable to what the EU was able to do 10 years ago after the Crimea annexation. In this case, it was very difficult to agree on personal sanctions. Now we have 11 packages of sanctions. A and we are by large, the European Union, the stronger economic supporter of Ukraine.
I want to end with some quick thoughts about migration, which some have described as the most corrosive, the most dangerous and divisive issue facing the European Union today. You're Italian. You know that your Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, is saying that Italy is being invaded and that Italy will not, to quote her phrase, become Europe's refugee camp. But you're Economy Commissioner. You also know that Europe, in demographic terms, desperately needs, in the long run, the boost that comes with immigrant labour. So how are you going to square that circle?
I think we need to put it simply, but then implementation is not so easy. We need to gradually and strongly shift from illegal migration to legal migration. Yes, indeed, as you were saying, we need legal migration. We have a very tight labor market, despite the low growth, and in several areas we have job vacancies. So
do you think the Italian people, you know Italy well, do you think they are listening and understanding that argument that you've just outlined?
All the business community in the center, north, and north of Italy very aware and use legal migrants. The problem is that to reduce illegal migration, we need the European cooperation, but we need also to strengthen legal migration.
Yeah, you don't have European cooperation. The idea of burden sharing is an important one, but frankly, if you talk to people in Hungary, in Poland, in many other countries, they are not interested.
Making progress, you know that migration is always the most divisive issue. I remember very well how it influenced also the UK referendum conversation on migration and the invasion, etc. I don't think that we can refer to invasions. Migration will be with us for the next decades. We have to bring irregular migration into legal migration.
But you are a former national politician in Italy of the centre-left. You know as well as I do that the migration issue is fueling anger amongst populations, and it is powering the right and sometimes the far right in countries across Europe. In 2019, you said this: liberal democracies face a double competition, one from radical alternatives like China, but another from within. There is, you said, an anti-democratic contagion internally, which is becoming a real threat. Multilateralism, free trade, environmental sustainability, and freedom are all at risk. That was 4 years ago. Do you think things are getting worse?
They went better for a certain period, also thanks to the multilateral vision of the new US administration. They went better thanks to our collective response to COVID. But now the risk is that we go back to this risk. So we have, I think, to be very careful showing that we have a common purpose in addressing migration, because migration is the main trigger for this potential anti-democratic tendency in all European countries. I'm not referring only to the EU. This is a real threat that we have to address collectively. And I think that...
And right now you don't have the tools.
No, we are working on, we are near to have an agreement, a new migration pact. And I think there is the awareness of the fact that we should shift from illegal to legal. This is already very important. Implement it will not be very easy, of course.
And there, Commissioner Gentiloni, we have to leave it. I thank you very much indeed for joining me on Hard Talk.
Thank you.